Hello, welcome everyone. It's a delight to be with you here in Carborough this morning. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it is my delight to welcome you to this look back at the great battles against Germany in 1943, 80 years ago this year. So welcome one and all. Before we begin, for those in the in-house audience, we do need to ask you to silence your noise-making devices, if you would, for the comfort of you and your fellow listeners and the speaker as well. If you are, this is my joke now since COVID, but it's true, if you're watching on your phone in the online audience, don't turn off your phone or else you know what will happen. It's a real delight to be with you here. Our weekend seminars are the backbone of what we do, and the community that we've created over many years. It's, as you know, COVID has sort of pulled us apart, and it's so great to see so many familiar faces coming back together, and we hope to continue to grow this community as people become more comfortable coming out to them. So thank you for making the time. I also want to thank a few people. Of course, we want to thank Paul Bonici back there doing all the technology. Put your hands together for Paul, who kept us in the public eye for so many years and for so many events. And of course, the incomparable Vicki Breeden out there. Clap loudly so she can hear you. We're very, we've got a few more events with Vicki left. Vicki is in a transition to doing incredible things. I just wanted to say you should follow Vicki Breeden on Instagram, because if you were following her in the last few weeks, you would have seen her in Nepal doing incredible things, and is just about to embark on a world of adventure that should be worthy of a seminar in a few years when we have Vicki come back and tell us about her adventures. But certainly want to thank Vicki for all she does, setting all this up, and of course all the staff. I want to thank our partners who help promote and put on our programs, especially our partners who sponsor us, including the Mirka Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, who help us with our K-12 programs, as well as the North Caroliniana Society, who are really wonderful underwriters of our teacher workshops in the summer, and of course our partner, the General Alumni Association, which is our partner in putting on programs, promoting programs. If you're a member of the General Alumni Association, that's great. If you are not, you should sign up and become a member. You don't have to be an alum, and there are all sorts of perks that come along with that. I also would like to thank members of our external advisory board. If I could just ask them to raise their hands up high so we can give them a round of applause. Our fearless leader, Joe Rytalk, is right there, so thank you, Joe. Our advisory board are very special partners with us who have provided us great advice and counsel as we've gone through so many transitions. I'm going to describe a little bit about what Carolina Public Humanities does, and just to be aware that our advisory board has been part of, again, this incredible transformation from a program that in 2009, when I started, only did these weekend seminars. Now, Carolina Public Humanities has a very extensive projects, including, of course, our great books reading groups at Flyleaf Books, our wonderful lecture series at Humanities in Action, special events around town. We also have a very extensive K-12 outreach program called Carolina K-12, which is providing wonderful resources for teachers throughout the state, and again, providing them with access to the great faculty and scholarship of UNC, and an extensive outreach program with community colleges and partners throughout the state, including a exciting project that we're embarking on with the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources for the refashioning of narratives for historic sites. Really wonderful programming that we're doing all around the state that you don't see here. So I'll talk a little bit later in one of our breaks about how you might support some of our activities involving the other side, if you will, the service side of Carolina Public Humanities. Let's quickly talk about what we're going to be doing today. Inside of your packets here, you have our agenda. And you'll notice Dr. Weinberg is over to my left over here. He'll be coming up and speaking to us. We have a nice section of about an hour and 15 minutes. Dr. Weinberg will speak. And then the remainder of the time, we'll go around with questions. I want to remind you folks, call on me with the questions. I'll come to you with the microphone. That way, Dr. Weinberg will hear your question, as well as the people out in the audience will hear your question as well. So get my attention there. You'll notice we have breaks. We'll be doing breaks in the Williams room, which is just right next door. We'll have snacks available for you. And of course, we'll do our lunch there as well. So if you're dining with us, remember to bring your meal ticket right here. So, if you want to dine around, there's plenty. We're in the middle of Carborough, the Paris of the Piedmont. So there's plenty. There's plenty all around you to enjoy as well. Also in your packets, you're going to find information on our speaker, who I'll talk about in just a moment, but these two things as well. We want to know what you think, the evaluation, so let us know. We, as I always say, we're interested in your comments. We love your praise, but we take our criticism seriously as well, so please let us know what you think of any aspect of this program. And if you are interested in having us cover some topics, you'd be surprised the number of topics that have generated with you, the audience. You can let us know here, and we'll do our best to see if we can find faculty or scholarship that matches your interests. On the other side of the packet here, folks, I just want to bring your attention to a list of people. You can play the Match the Name Badge. I'm sorry I didn't put on my name badge, so I'll put it on so you can do that. Match the name badge to the name list here game. Unfortunately, you can't do that for the online folks. But I also want to point out that we have a list of folks. We don't have any inductees here, but on the back of this program, I'll talk a little bit about giving. There's other information here. I'll do that a little bit later. But there's something here called Carolina Public Humanities Alumni. And you'll just notice we have some really impressive people here, including in the list of 125 or more seminars is none other than Eva Lewis Walker. And I just want to say today, not only did amazing things happen 80 years ago that we're going to be learning about in 1943, but the most amazing thing that happened in 1943 was the birth of Miss Eva Walker. So put your hands together. Happy birthday. We'll be sure to do some embarrassing singing. You'll get this low sonorous baritone later. You'll hear it. Merci, de rien. And félicitations. We have, okay, let's get right to it. Also, I also want to thank also, some of you notice you have green dots on your things, right? Maybe you noticed that. That is because this is your first seminar. So let's welcome our first-time attendees. Thank you for joining us. Put your hands together. Someday, look, see this list? Someday you're going to hit 125 seminars, and it'll be on your birthday at the same time. So that'll be exciting. All right, let's get right to it. We're all here. We know why we're here. We've been working with our speaker for so long and are so honored to always be able to present his incredible scholarship. Our speaker, of course, is none other than Gerhard Weinberg, the William Rand Keene Jr. Professor of History Emeritus from Chapel Hill. He is, I don't need to tell you this, he is one of the leading historians on the history of World War II, especially the military history of it. I was born in Germany. We've had wonderful sessions where we've learned about Gerhard Weinberg's life as well, his incredible life story. Born in Germany, educated in the United States. He earned his MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. And of course did a lot of work and research documentation project in Alexandria, Virginia, which really provided him access to some incredible archives. He has taught at the University of Kentucky, at the University of Michigan, before coming to Chapel Hill, where he has been a faculty member since 1974. He retired from teaching in 1999, but you wouldn't know it by the number of times since 1999 that he has taught all of us here. Dr. Weinberg is a prolific author of works on military history, including A World at Arms, A Global History of World War II, which is a very large book and perhaps the best single-volume history of the war ever written. He's also the author of Visions of Victory, Hopes of 8 World War II Leaders, Hitler's Foreign Policy, 1933 to 1939. And perhaps the most impressive is Hitler's second book, the unpublished sequel to Mein Kampf. Here we have Gerhard Weinberg, who not only knows history, but creates history by finding this incredible second volume. And it's also a wonderful story. The labor of getting that published is one of the most incredible stories I've ever heard. So if you have a chance, you can maybe get that story directly from Dr. Weinberg. Dr. Weinberg is also well known throughout the country and throughout the world for his military history, having received the American Historical Society's George Louis Beer Prize in 1972 for the foreign policy of Hitler's Germany, and receiving in 2010 the prestigious Pritzker Military Library Literature Award. This is sort of the Nobel Prize of military historians, very well deserved. And of course, in 2011, that was followed up by the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize for a lifetime achievement by the Society of Military History. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Gerhard Weinberg as he takes us back 80 years. Please put your hands together for Dr. Gerhard Weinberg.
Thanks for the introduction. We're going to talk about some aspects of the Second World War in Europe and North Africa. Hitler expected that the Germany that he had begun to rule in 1933 would wage 4 wars for the basis of German domination of the globe. The first would be against Czechoslovakia to strengthen Germany's position in Central Europe. The second would be against Britain and France because the German army could not be sent to the Urals and beyond into Asia, with British and French military forces a short distance from Germany's main industrial area. The third war would be against the Soviet Union, and it would provide Germany, once conquered, with very extensive living space and the petroleum resources that Germany would need for the fourth war, that against the United States. And that would assure Germany's world domination. The first war was called off by Hitler at the last moment at the Munich conference, a step he would consider the worst mistake of his career to the last days of his life. To make certain that no one cheated him of war, of the Second War, as he believed British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had done in 1938. In 1939, Hitler had the German ambassadors in London, Paris, and Warsaw kept in Germany. No one was going to treat him the second time around. So he launched that on the 1st of September, 1939. He hoped to finish number 2 either still in 39 or early in 1940, so that he could launch number 3 against the Soviet Union in the summer or the fall of 1940. But a variety of developments led to repeated postponements until the 22nd of June in 1941. The expectation his and his military advisors was that they would crush the Soviet Union very quickly. And it is worth noting that Hitler's plan for a new, very wide gauge railway in the German Empire included a major line that went from Berlin, Germany's capital, to Vladivostok, the Soviet Union's main port on the Pacific Ocean. The reality in 1941 was that the Red Army slowed down the German advance and stopped and reversed it in early December of 1941 by a major counteroffensive in the Moscow area. I should point out that in addition to the offensive at Moscow, there was another. Let me just see if I can get this to operate. Why won't this work? This is not working. Which one?
So go forward.
Yeah, okay.
Or that, or you can go backwards if you want. This
one. In addition to the success of the Russians before Moscow, there was also a success at the northern excuse me, I've got to, I thought that one was working.
This button on the top is a pointer. You want to use
Oh, okay.
this button on the top. So that's a multi.
At the top at Tikvin, and there was also a German setback here at the southern end of the front. It was obvious, therefore, that the war would continue on the Eastern Front into 1942. Now, the question was, what would happen in 1942? And I think this is terribly important to keep in mind. Hitler had to make up his mind what to do, and Stalin had to make up his mind. Hitler decided that since Germany, after its halt in 41, could not have a north, central, and southern offensive, it had to concentrate on one offensive. And he decided that it would do so at the southern end of the front. And in that connection, it was going to go into the Caucasus to get the oil fields. You will recall that from the German point of view, those were important for the next war, the one against the United States, where you're going to need intercontinental bombers and a bigger navy and so on and so forth, all of which used lots of oil. On the 19th of November, 41, he worked out with General Halder, the German Army Chief of Staff, the plan, hopefully to start in March and April of 42 on the offensive in the south. Stalin, after the Soviet halt of the Germans in December 41, decided in 42 that the Germans would probably try again to take Moscow, and therefore there would be a major Soviet offensive on the central part of the front, that is to say, the Moscow front. Now, in reality, the Germans began in the south by clearing up what the let's see, where is this? And in the Crimea, why does this thing not work? There it is. They cleared up the Crimea, which they had been not able to do in 41. And so by June, end of July of 42, they had that. And that was when they began the offensive, which you see outlined by this map. As they moved that force, they also moved a force from that southern front advance towards Stalingrad, as you can see on that map. That was not because its name sounded intriguing, but because this was to enable them to barrier both the Russian use of the Volga to move supplies and to prevent them from afterwards driving south and cutting off the German forces that were headed into the Caucasus area. The Soviet counterattacks initially all failed, and the Germans advanced with roughly 1 million soldiers and their allies. If you attack on one part of the front, please note, the more successful you are, the longer your flanks become. That's inevitably a part of that. And it's a subject I'm going to come back to at the end of my talk. And for that, Germany did not have, after its 41 losses, the necessary forces and had to rely on its allies in that war. In addition, in other words, to its own approximately close to 1 million soldiers, there were well over 300,000 soldiers provided by Germany's allies, Romania, Hungary, and Italy. I will come back to the issue of these allies, and especially the Italian ally, later on in my talk. As the Germans moved forward, they were able to take one of the sets of oil wells in the Maikop area, but they never got to Grozny, to say nothing of Baku, which isn't on this map. In other words, the major Caucasus oil fields, they simply could not even get close to. They had in 42, as in 41, grossly underestimated the strength and willingness to fight of the Red Army. The Soviet, let me turn to them for a moment, Union, wanted all the help they could get from Britain and the United States, which were, of course, also at war with Germany at this time. They got some help, but not the one they wanted, an invasion of Europe in the West. The foreign minister, foreign commissar, Molotov, was in London and in Washington in May of 42 to urge help. But what happened was that the British and Americans sent aid to the Soviet Union in a port way in the north, into the across Iran, and then, ironically, to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, where the United States was shipping things for the Soviet Union from the West Coast via Alaska. So they were getting some. But what is too often forgotten is that from the perspective of the British and Americans, one of the most important theaters of the Second World War was the Atlantic Ocean, where German submarines were attacking and sinking not just warships, but primarily merchant ships. And in September and October of 1942, at the time as the Germans and Soviets are fighting in the issues I've just talked about, were the worst months of the Second World War for sinking. And they, Western allies, and I will come back to this, excuse me, in my second lecture, were planning an invasion of North Africa because they were not yet able to do anything in Western Europe and would not be for quite a while. Now, in the summer of 42, the Soviet Union did launch, Stalin had insisted, a major offensive operation on the central part of the Eastern Front, Operation Mars, but it was halted by the Germans. Having lost that effort, the Soviets then decided that their only real possibility was to do something about this German advance in the south. Not just to fight, to halt, but hopefully to take advantage of the, by definition, lengthier flanks of the German advance. The further the Germans advanced and fought their way into Stalingrad and into the Caucasus, the longer their flanks became. And the more dependent the Germans were on their allies to man these steadily growing, lengthening fronts. And on, we don't know quite sure, either the 27th or 28th of September, the Soviet leadership decided on an operation to cut into the flanks of the German advance into Stalingrad, and proceeded to do so on the 19th of November. In other words, what happens is that the Soviets attack from here and here into the Romanian and Hungarian and Italian forces that are protecting the lengthening flanks of the German 6th Army and also the 5th Panzer Army, which is fighting block by block and house by house in the streets of Stalingrad. And as they succeed in doing this, that is to say, the two thrusts meet, the Germans have some choices. There were really three, I would suggest. They could evacuate or try to evacuate the forces that had been cut off. That is to say, the German 6th Army, part of their 4th Panzer Army, and a small part of the Romanian forces, all cut off by this Russian advance. They could try to break across this barrier created by the Red Army by breaking into it an offensive from the area still held. And the third choice, obviously, was to just stay there. They tried first to break into it. This is Operation Winter Storm, the Germans called it, December of 42, and it fails. The real situation, therefore, is that, let's see if we, the Red Army expands its hold and keeps the Germans contained. The Germans had, in the preceding winter, been able to keep and supply a completely cut off piece of their front on the Central Front by air supply. They proceeded to do this for the forced cutoff in Stalingrad. There were two big problems about this air supply operation. One was the total number of soldiers, excuse me, cut off in Stalingrad was at least 6-7 times the number that had been cut off the previous winter and supplied on the Central Front. The job, in other words, was much bigger. The other problem was, please note, we are talking of the winter of 42, 43, and in early November, the Western Allies, as we'll talk later on in my next talk, had landed in Northwest Africa, and to move troops and supplies for the troops into Northwest Africa, primarily into Tunisia, the Germans had to use transport planes. And there wasn't any way, obviously, that the same airplane could carry troops and supplies from Italy and Sardinia to Tunisia, and at the same time fly from German bases in the Ukraine to Stalingrad. just as we tend to forget this, the Western allies, as they invade Northwest Africa, are aided by the fact that the Russians are keeping most of the German army and air force busy on the Eastern Front. So on the Eastern Front, in the winter, excuse me, of 42, 43, the Russians are benefiting from the fact that the Western allies have landed in Northwest Africa, and the German transport planes that are busy there obviously cannot be flying in supplies to the German forces cut off in Stalingrad. So what the Germans are doing simply doesn't, it works some, and they fly out the wounded German soldiers. That's when the planes come back, and some of the officers. But it just simply doesn't work effectively. And with the failure of the December winter storm operation that I mentioned earlier, what happens is that the soldiers, the German soldiers, are simply not supplied sufficiently, and many of them literally die of hunger and exhaustion. And there are some rather intriguing comments preserved of doctors in the medical facilities of the German Sixth Army who see their patients dying without serious wounds. Not because they've been badly wounded, but because they're just exhausted and no longer sufficiently fed. And they have, by this time, please remember, the German offensive on the south started in July of 42. They're just exhausted. And it is, at least it was for me, intriguing many years ago when I was working in the relevant German records, is the comments of the doctors that whatever injuries from the fighting their patients have aren't killing them. What's causing their deaths is primarily exhaustion and hunger. They're just through as a result of the long fighting. And what you want to keep in mind, we are talking now of January 1943. And the reason that the German doctors are so puzzled at first is that up to this point in the Second World War, nothing of this sort had happened to the German army. In early February of 43, what's left of the surrounded forces surrenders. Somewhere around 90,000 are taken prisoner. Somewhere around 30,000 have been flown out. That is to say, when the supply airplanes went back to the German-controlled bases in the occupied Ukraine. And the Germans launch another counteroffensive in the Kharkov area, which is somewhat successful, but doesn't really make much difference on the main part of the front. What this all means, I think, has to be looked at very carefully. For the Germans, this is considerably worse, in a way, than their defeat before Moscow in December 41, because it came, number one, at the end of a very major offensive, very much publicized inside Germany and the rest of the world, in which they had hoped to conquer the oil wells, which obviously they had not, which are gone, and where in a city named for the leader of the other side, Joseph Stalin, a German field marshal, Paulus, has had to surrender whatever is left of his troops. Something that in World War II had never happened before. And please remember that the adults in Germany at the time we're talking about had all lived through World War I. And nothing of this sort, excuse me, had happened to the Germans in the First World War. And since, for a variety of reasons which the German people argued about, they had lost the First World War, that's something that was even worse than anything that had happened to them in the First World War now happens to them in the Second, has very important morale implications. One of the reasons the Germans thought, both in the leadership and in the public, that one reason they had lost that big war and had to surrender or sign an armistice in 1918 and peace in 1919, had been exhaustion or inadequate mobilization of the German home front. And it is therefore, in my opinion, not quite so surprising as it sometimes is alleged to be in the literature, that Hitler, in a major speech on the 13th of January 43, and Goebbels in a major speech and a huge rally on the 30th of January 43, calls for total war. Since allegedly, in the eyes of some, they had lost the First World War because they hadn't mobilized as much as they needed to. They were going to avoid having that happen again by a total mobilization. For the United States and Great Britain, the victory of the Red Army, Soviet forces in the Stalingrad operation had very significant meaning. It meant that we could, for certain now, rely on the Soviets to keep somewhere between 2/3 and 4/5 of the German military busy on the Eastern Front. We would need to continue fighting, and I'll discuss this in my next lecture. During the last weeks of the Stalingrad fighting, the British and American leaders are gathered in North Africa, not just to inspect their troops who have landed, but to decide what to do next in the war. And they know, as they plan at Casablanca, we'll talk about that later, that obviously there are things that they can plan to do that will be difficult. But the Soviet Union will continue to do, its forces will continue to do the majority of the fighting. Other country that we have to look at is, what does this mean for Germany's allies? It means for Romania and Hungary, not merely that they have lost lots of soldiers in the fighting, but that quite clearly, number one, the Germans are not going to defeat the Soviet Union. And that means, if we can get another map, let me just give this a try. That the Red Army is going to move into the Balkans, that as the Germans are forced to retreat, the Red Army will attack into Romania and Hungary. Let me now turn to the impact on Italy. There is, in the, if you will, obvious and direct impact that of the over 200,000 Italian soldiers sent to the southern part of the Eastern Front to help the Germans in their big offensive. Not only is the majority of those soldiers killed or captured in the fighting at Stalingrad, but the Italian home front is enormously affected. We tend to overlook this, and you will not find this discussed in the literature, but it seems to me very important. For people in Hungary fighting the Soviet Union, at least for many of them, made some sense. In their alliance with Germany, they had been able in 1938 to acquire the easternmost portion of Czechoslovakia when that country was divided. And they hoped to get some pieces of what once upon a time had been Poland and had been acquired by the Soviet Union in their agreement with Germany in the partition of Poland. There was something, if you will, for Hungary in the Eastern Front. Romania in 1939-40 had lost a big hunk of its territory to the Soviet Union in accordance with the terms of the German-Soviet 1939 partition of Eastern Europe. And their military forces had reacquired Bessarabia to be reincorporated into Romania. And there was an additional piece of the nearby Ukraine that the Romanians were occupying and hoped to annex to Romania. And so, again, for people, not all, but lots of people in Romania, fighting alongside the Germans against the Soviet Union made some sense. But for the Italians, what on earth was Italy going to acquire? Or how was it going to benefit by fighting the Russians in places that nobody in Italy had ever heard of or cared about in the least? The whole notion of Mussolini in providing a small addition to the German military effort in the East in 1941 had begun to raise questions among Italians. What's the point here? Why aren't we, and I'll talk about this in my second lecture, why aren't we defending our colonies more effectively? We cannot defend our colonies in Africa by sending troops to Germany's Eastern Front. And now in 1942, when Mussolini decides to send about a quarter, not just about 250,000 Italian troops to fight alongside the Germans at the southern end of the Eastern Front, what upsets the public in Italy is not, as you would obviously expect, the casualties that over a third of these men never come home, but the whole point of this. It's all fine for the Germans to go to Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus, the highest point in Europe, and hoist a swastika flag there. That's their issue. What in the tweet is this Italy's business when we're having trouble fighting the British? Huh? I will come back to this issue, but people and the literature tends to bypass the importance for domestic politics in Italy of the large numbers of Italian troops sent to fight on the Eastern Front, and in particular the southern part of it, where a very high proportion of them, you see different statistics, but it's at least a third of them, and maybe half, are killed or captured. And one cannot, in my opinion, understand what happens in Italy after Stalingrad without remembering the 225,000 at least Italian soldiers who were sent to fight there, of whom a very large proportion will never see Italy again. Now, let me turn to the Soviet side of this. Stalin had made very major strategic errors in the first part of the war in the East. He had assumed that in 1941, the Germans, because they wanted the resources of the Ukraine, would emphasize the southern part of the Eastern Front. It turned out, and he allocated forces accordingly in 41. It turned out, of course, that this was a misjudgment on his part. The Germans put this major effort on the central part of the front. So it was slower on the southern. He assumed for 42, as I've already mentioned, that the Germans would emphasize the central part of the front. And so that's what he had done, and that's where that Operation Mars was launched. That turned out to be another mistake, because as I trust you know by now, the Germans concentrated not on the central, but the southern part of the front. Hereafter, I'm talking about after the winter of 42-43, Stalin begins to pay more attention to his top military advisors, especially Zhukov and Vasilevsky, and is inclined, at least from time to time, not only to pay attention to his top military advisors, but to follow their advice, even when it differs from his own preferences. And I think it's fair to say that that is true essentially for the balance of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Ironically, for Hitler, it's the opposite. He had paid occasional attention to his military leaders before. But after Stalingrad, he pays attention to them less and less. There is one, Field Marshal Manstein, to whom he pays some attention, because after the Stalingrad disaster, Manstein leads a successful counteroffensive in the early spring of 43 in the Kharkov area. But generally speaking, you have a kind of opposite development. That is to say, in the early part of the Eastern Front War, Stalin pays little attention to his military top leaders, and after Stalingrad pays more and more. That's the opposite of Hitler's decisions. Up to early 43, he'd been paying some attention to his military advisors. Afterwards, it's less and less and less. There is one further very important aspect of the impact of Stalingrad, and that is that it increases for a while Stalin's idea of making peace with Germany. he had already in 42, after having halted the German advance in December of 41, Stalin was clearly thinking about a compromise peace with Germany. And by the end of 41 and early 42, the Japanese, Germany's ally at this time, is urging the Germans to make peace with the Soviet Union. And by late 42, early 43, partly under the impact of Stalingrad, his ally Mussolini, the Italian leader, is urging Hitler to make peace with the Soviet Union, since there are signs, diplomatic signs, mainly through Stockholm, the capital of neutral Sweden, that the Soviets might be interested. Increasingly also, a couple of German leaders are urging Hitler to go back to the 1939 notion of a peace with the Soviet Union and concentrate on the other enemies of Germany. By this time, of course, primarily Britain and the United States. Goebbels discusses this in a very interesting way with Hitler. And this at a time when the Germans have diplomatic signs that Stalin might be interested, through the fact that, as I mentioned, in Stockholm, the capital of neutral Sweden, both sides have diplomats. And there are possibilities of using intermediaries to let the other side know what anything you would like for the other side to know. Okay? And when Goebbels discusses this with Hitler, Hitler tells him that this is impossible because there are two demands that Germany must make that Stalin will not and cannot agree to. We have to have the Ukraine, and we have to have the Caucasus oil fields. And there is no way that Stalin will agree to that. And in this regard, Hitler's assessment of Stalin was undoubtedly correct. That because the relevant records have never been opened of Stalin's, and the paper by now may have deteriorated to the point where even if it's open, nobody can read it. I mean that seriously. We don't know what Stalin was prepared to concede in a compromise peace with Germany. But it certainly wasn't turning over the Ukraine and the Caucasus. That we can be certain of. Maybe a little more of Poland than the 1939 partition of Poland between them. Who knows? Maybe he would have been willing to let them have Lithuania. But in any case, the things which Hitler told Goebbels Germany had to insist on, Hitler was correct in saying that Stalin would never agree to that. So that while there are those in the Japanese and Italian governments who are urging Germany to make peace with the Soviet Union, And there are those in the top German levels who think that would be a good idea. And there are signs that well into 1943, Stalin is interested in a compromise peace with Germany. There isn't going to be any compromise peace. I will take a couple of minutes to comment on one other aspect of the Stalingrad disaster, which you will not find in any of the books on World War II, and which you are allowed to dismiss as one of my more foolish ideas. As those of you who have read and studied about the campaign in Western Europe in 1944-45 know, Eisenhower, the Allied commander, had an endless debate with the British commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, and the American General Patton. The latter two were invariably arguing in favor of a thrust on one part of the front deep into Germany. And Eisenhower was always arguing for a broad front push. It remains my personal view that all of the publicity at the time about the Stalingrad battles had their influence on Eisenhower. You push very far on one part of the front, the Germans will find a way to cut that off, because the more successful you are, the longer your flanks become. And how do you protect those ever lengthening fronts? The Germans had found out the hard way that you had to have Allied troops there. And those Allied troops were crushed by the Red Army. The one time on the Western Front that Eisenhower sort of half allowed Montgomery to try something different at the northern end of the front came Operation Market Garden, which of course failed. One of those things. But one has to consider the realities, and everybody in the room is entitled to think that Stalingrad did not influence Eisenhower's consistent and vehement argument repeatedly with Montgomery and Patton over this issue of a front in one area. And now we have the time for questions and comments. Thank you.
I will remind folks on the online audience that you can use the button at the bottom of your screen to do a question. We'll start with questions with the in-house audience first, and we'll start with Bill, who has, by the way, you're going to hear a wonderful voice.
Dr. Weinberg, would you comment on the intelligence that was available to the German generals and whether or not that contributed to their miscalculation?
The intelligence that the German military had was mixed. They knew a great deal about the Red Army, but they held on to the same mistaken assessment of Soviet human beings as inferior and not properly able to fight. We tend to forget that if people over a long period of time consider themselves superior to others, it's very difficult to disabuse them of this kind of nonsense. And there were undoubtedly the deficiencies in German intelligence, but the real deficiency was in the assessment of what they knew. That is to say, the population and industrial capacities of the Soviet Union were no great secret. What they could not understand, most of them, was the extent to which mobilization could proceed, the extent to which the removal of industrial equipment out of the areas the Germans were occupying in their 1941 advance could produce things in the unoccupied parts of the Soviet Union. There is this constant underestimation. And it seems to me, at least, that this is, to a considerable extent, a part of their thinking of superiority. And that thinking of superiority, please keep in mind, the top leaders are all veterans of the First World War, is in part the result of their having beaten the Russians in the First World War. If Germany, I ask you to think of this the way a German general in 1941, 42, or 43 thought. If Germany could beat Russia and knock it out of the war in 1917, at a time when most of us are fighting on the Western Front, then now that we don't have a Western Front to worry about, we can just slap in the face and knock them down. The notion, in other words, that the Germans could more easily, more rapidly defeat the Soviet Union in the Second World War than they had defeated Russia in the First World War has to be seen as a part of the misapprehension of what was going on the Eastern Front. And in that regard, you see, the German military leaderships not being that impressed by the forces provided by their Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies is simply a repetition of their attitude towards Austria-Hungary's army in the First World War. There is, in my judgment, no way to understand much of World War II without remembering the experience and how it is interpreted by people at the time who have experienced the First World War as a very important part of their lives.
We have a question. I want to remind folks, I have some questions on deck here. I'm going to have to take some questions from the online audience. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but of course you can talk to Dr. Weinberg in the breaks as well. Anne.
What did it mean when Hitler called for total war?
Cannot hear you.
What did it mean when Hitler called for total war? You said in the winter of 43 he called for total war. What difference did that make? What was that?
The call for total war by both Hitler and Goebbels in January of 43 meant a tightening of rationing, a mobilization of older and younger people, a restriction of rationing, and longer work in factories and so on. It was, if you will, a tightening. And that was something they had not wanted to do earlier because they believed that Germany would have won the First World War if they had been tighter at home, was one of the factors in their not winning the last time.
Okay. We have a question here.
I know this was not part of your presentation, but I wondered if you would...
Louder, I cannot hear.
I know this was not part of your presentation on Stalingrad, but what about Leningrad? The Germans won Leningrad, and from what I understand, they were there for over 900 days. Did this not affect Stalin at all?
The question is about, could you speak to what was going on in Leningrad, up north in Leningrad, and its effect on the calculations that Stalin was thinking about in terms of the counteroffensive? Just speak a little bit about the impact of Leningrad.
Well, the Leningrad is besieged by the Germans starting in late 1941, and quite literally several 100,000 of the inhabitants die of hunger during that siege. But they can't take it. And in the winter of 41, 42, and in the winter of 42, 43, the Russians are providing supplies for the troops fighting in Leningrad over the frozen Lake Ladoga. And so eventually what happens is that the Russians break the siege, and by January 44, the siege is over. And by that time also, the Finns are in big trouble, and they will pull out of the war later in 44.
We have a question here.
What was the composition of the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian forces on the flank of Stalingrad, and what was the primary factor for their defeat in the Russian flanking attack?
The question was regarding the Nazis' allies, the Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians.
I'm sorry, come up here, I cannot hear you.
The question was related to the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian allies and about the composition of those forces and why it was so easy to defeat them.
It wasn't that easy to defeat them. They fought hard too. But they did not have the replacement systems that the German and Soviet systems had. And the Russians had very carefully collected forces for those Uranus operation attacks. The attacking forces were superior, and there was one other very important aspect in which the Russians were superior, and that is the Germans get a really good tank, the Mark V and the Mark VI, in the winter of 42, 43. Invading a country in 1941, a year and a half before you have real tanks, is not the smartest thing anybody has ever done. The German Mark III and their heavy tank Mark IV were distinctly inferior to the Soviet Mark 34 and KV-1 and KV-2 tanks. And when the Russians in the winter of 1942-43 are attacking the forces of Germany's allies, whom the Germans need to protect their flanks of their advance. For the most part, all they have is the equivalent of the Mark III. They do not have either the Tiger or the Panther, and they don't even have enough Mark IV tanks. And so the Russian armored forces, which are used in the strikes, obviously there are some 88 millimeter anti-tank guns that will destroy them. But the allies of Germany are simply not fully equipped with these things. And I think we have to keep in mind this important difference in military equipment. And it is one that was already, I might add, important in 41 at the very beginning, and plays a role throughout the fighting on the Eastern Front.
We have time for one more question here before we break at 10:55. So,
Thank you. In your opinion, did Lend-Lease have any significant impact on the Russian ability to defend Stalingrad and ultimately prevail?
the question was concerning the Lend-Lease program and its impact on the Soviet Union's ability to conduct the Stalingrad operation. How important was the Lend-Lease program for this?
There is no question in my mind, though there is in the minds of many, that the Lend-Lease plays a significant role in helping the Soviet Union in its fighting. A high proportion goes through the Persian Gulf and across Iran or Persia, whichever you want to call it. A substantial portion is taken to Murmansk and Archangel up in the north in the Arctic, and a substantial portion across the North Pacific to Vladivostok, and then across the Trans-Siberian Railway. And there's no question that this does make a substantial impact and helps the Soviet Union in its fighting, both by supplies and weapons, and tens of thousands of trucks, so that by what the Germans find odd is that when the Russian army in 45 is fighting in Germany, its trucks are practically all American. When you are in East Germany, you do not expect soldiers coming from the East to be driving and riding in American trucks. The reality, however, is that by the latter part of the war, the majority of the trucks used by the Red Army have been built in the United States and shipped there. And there is the further rather intriguing aspect, I think, of this, that the Japanese, who are at war with the United States from December 41 on, as you know, are careful about Russian ships carrying supplies from Alaska to Vladivostok, because they have an agreement and hope the Soviets will keep it with the Soviet Union. So that is, if you will, a good way to ship some stuff to the Soviets. The irony of it all is, in my opinion, that when Germany and the Soviet Union were allied, Stalin would do for his dear friend Adolf things he would never do for Roosevelt or Churchill. And one of them was icebreakers north of Siberia. He would use them so that the Germans could send a warship into the Pacific to sink Allied ships, as they did. But while his allies after June 41 are losing ships to the Germans, he never allows them to have Soviet icebreakers bring stuff across northern Siberia, as he did, as I said, for the Germans. One of those things.
Well, with the mention of icebreakers, I think it's time for us to take a break. So put your hands together, Professor Weinberg.